Hello, everyone. I am Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby with Jessica Stone, the director of the new Broadway musical Water for Elephants. And Jessica, this has started as a novel, has already been adapted into a film. So I'm curious, was there a certain aspect of the story that you kind of latched on to that made you say, this is how I'm gonna have my way in for the stage adaptation?
Yes, great question. The novel is a really, really fun read. And a lot of what I think makes it fun is there's so much historical detail, not just to the circus, but to just Depression era America and what it meant to travel all over America during this time. And the stakes were really high. People were boiling shoe leather to eat.
Right.
So that is not necessarily something, those historical details are not something you necessarily sing about. And I watched the movie and enjoyed it, but it also made sense to me that that's the stuff that would make the movie compelling to look at,
Mhm.
is all that detail. So to me, um, the thing I that was my way in was this idea of this protagonist at two different times in his life making a choice, having just recently lost everything. And how do you pivot? How do you choose? Who are you when you lose everything? And so I hope that's not me dinging. Is that me?
It's
I don't
okay.
I don't know how to fix it because I'm old. Um, but so that to me is something that you sing about. And we started working on it. I came out to the project in 2018, and it's funny, this season, there is a lot of that device. There's a lot of, a memory play
Yeah.
element, um, which is interesting to me. It's not like we all got in a room and said, let's all tell a story this way this season. Um, but I do think it's interesting. And I think a lot of it had to do with the pandemic. Even though we started working on it before the pandemic, the sense of taking stock of your life, and who are you to your neighbor when we all have nothing, became very, very fertile ground from which to tell this story. And so I think it's probably not an accident that there are so many tales this season around some of that, around
Yeah.
memory, around taking stock of a life. Um, so that to me became a really interesting way to tell the story, because once you're dealing with memory, it doesn't have to be literal. It doesn't have to be linear. Often the thing about memory, it's you remember what you feel or what you felt, and the rest of it is blurrier. So when Jacob joins the circus, they were actually working, and then did someone actually peel off into a cartwheel as I was walking by? Probably not, but that's what it felt like,
Mm.
when he joined that day. When he fell in love, what he remembers is feeling the the utter awe and skill of this woman that he fell in love with, and her ability to tame a horse. So some of that was really, really fun to work with in terms of puppetry and circus and choreo and writing and music, because it has to do with the most vibrant chapters of your life.
Yeah. Well, I want to dive into that a little bit because there is so much going on in this show, and I feel like it's a gargantuan task for a director because it does mix, it's like a fusion of musical theater, circus, puppetry. Did you understand what a enormous job you were signing on for when you took this?
No, as a matter of fact, when I was called in to meet on it, I was like, oh, I had been directing for a really long time all over the country. And I was in talks with Kimberly Akimbo at the same time. So I actually got these offers, two wildly different shows that I both adore, at the same month.
Wow.
And so when I met on this project, I was like, I've never pitched a show like this before. I've never worked with puppets or circus, and there's a stampede and a train and an elephant, and I've never done anything like that before. So let me just see how far I get. Like I never actually imagined that I would be offered the job. I just thought, well, this is a good experience for me to sort of think this way and brainstorm. Um, and I just happened to meet one of the producers I had known in another capacity. But I just happened to meet two producers that really think outside of the box
Mhm.
and really put their money where their mouth is in terms of building a community of people from of all different stripes. And they took a chance.
Yeah. And what I love too is that even though there is so much spectacle to all of that, because this show offers so much, um, it still has a sort of organic, like stripped down quality to the aesthetic. And I'm just curious, how, like there's scaffolding that represents the train cars. There's moments of shadow puppetry. How did you arrive at that kind of aesthetic?
It still was, it was all in service to the story and how he remembered it. So having something really literal didn't feel useful. It's funny as you put together a show like this, and I didn't exactly answer your previous question, which is I never really thought of it as a big giant show. I just thought of it as many different layers that needed to be tackled. So I think maybe in part that's why it doesn't look like that's not why we don't have a giant just actual train on the stage. The other thing is when you're dealing with circus, particularly aerial elements of circus, you need quite a bit of space. The thing that I cared the most about in the show was community and the idea that you are very vulnerable if you don't have a family, a chosen family, your community of friends. And the circus community is much like the theatrical community in that they're highly, highly skilled and they do form this very tight family can mean different things to different people, but team. And so to me, it was more interesting to have space for people to hurl through the sky than room for all kinds of things to fly in.
Yeah.
And Takeshi Kata, our set designer, is also his aesthetic is poetic in
Yeah.
general. How do you pack the biggest punch with with the sparest, most efficient gesture? So some of that was luck of the draw, and some of it was practical, and some of it was the fact that it is memory. So in terms of the elephant, we don't meet her fully, not because we're being coy, but because they don't understand her and she doesn't understand them. So he only remembers flashes of her. And it's not until they really understand how and can actually communicate with her that we meet her in full.
Yeah. Um, I love what you said about specific gesture and all that because uh even though there is spectacle to this show, there are moments of like beautiful simplicity with the circus. And so I'm wondering how you collaborated with the circus performers because I'm thinking of moments like Easy, which I think is a great example of the fusion of these elements. And there's a singer singing to a puppet, also represented by an aerialist. And what's the key to making a simplicity rise to the occasion like that?
I didn't start out with the answer. There were many problems to solve early on. So initially, Easy was a woman with a drum, and it's just percussion, and the percussion represented the horse. That was 8 years ago. And when Shana Carroll, our circus designer and co-choreographer, that was probably the earliest collaboration. We started in a workshop in Montreal right before the pandemic. And we talked a lot about circus language, and I didn't really want people arbitrarily peeling off into back handsprings. Like everything has to be earned. And
Yeah.
so if you look at a number like Road Don't Make You Young, they're climbing poles and doing crazy things on the poles, but they're climbing the pole to hammer something. And then if there is a flash of acro in a way that's not connected to the work, it's because Jacob is feeling something.
Hmm.
Um, so so that choreo looks very different from, say, the physical expression of circus in the Grand Spec, which is traditional circus tricks, hula, Spanish web, swinging on a rope, at the end of the act because they're performing a specific charivari act at the end of Act One. Then you've got something like Easy, which I was really trying to crack the code in terms of how to do the animals. And I didn't, for instance, the Stampede, I didn't want to just see puppets chasing each other. And it is the protagonist is human. The protagonist is not a lion,
Right.
like Lion King. So our animals are going to be more fragmented and more impressionistic. So then it was about, well, we want to learn about Marlena in Easy. Is this going to be through circus expression, or is it going to be puppetry expression? And ultimately, as we were, talking about the germ, that the very kernel of the moment, we watch her tend to an injured animal who goes from feeling really agitated to feeling calm. And when a horse feels calm, what might he look like? And we were imagining just like galloping in a field and feeling ease. And then one step led to the next, and we were having baked brie at lunch. And she said, well, why don't we ask Natasha to get in a hoop? We looked at this research image of an aerialist in a horseshoe shaped hoop. And she said, let's look at Natasha. And we went through the steps, and Natasha started improvising in a hoop and started flying halfway through the number. And we started crying. And we are like, okay, so that's, so I didn't start out with the answers. It was just knowing emotionally and narratively what needed to happen in the moment and what were our tools at our
Mhm.
disposal.
Wow. And for all that circus and the puppetry that has to go into this, I think the show it wouldn't work if that core trio of actors and their relationships weren't so kind of finely tuned, with that, friendship that turns into a very tense love triangle. What was it like working with them on those three actors on that arc, and getting it to where it is?
Well, they're beautiful actors, all three of them. And it was also a lot of work in, the actual story in the book is fairly straightforward, oh, one's ill, it's an unhappy marriage, a young cutie comes along, and they reconfigure. And in a musical, there's very limited real estate in terms of book to map out what is arguably a pretty complex situation. So it required the efficiency of Rick Ellis and the poetry of Pigpen and the emotional wisdom of Grant and Izzy and Paul Nolan. So we didn't want August to just be a mustache twirling villain. And at the same time, very quickly, we have to really root for Marlena to leave him and go with someone else and root for her and not just think that she's cold-blooded, or cold-hearted.
Mhm.
Uh, and it takes some bravery actually to plumb some of those depths of not only mental illness, but also shock and trauma for Grant, whose character has just lost everything and is completely closed off to the world and is just running. He's just on the go, and is not looking to settle anywhere. So it was actually a pleasure to work with them because they were so game and willing and brought so much rich subtext to all of it.
Yeah. And I was realizing, speaking of other actors in the show, I think Greg Edelman, you've brought him back to Broadway for like the first time in more than 10 years. I think it was his last time here. What was it like working with him?
Oh, it's a pleasure working with Greg. And that's also a hard thing because you don't want Mr. Jankowski, Jacob, at the older part of his life, to only seem like a narrator. And again, there's very limited time to do it. And so, and it was a dance, we actually had him present in all kinds of different moments in the show. And it was like, oh, we're just with younger Jacob here. And now it's time to hear from older Jacob. But we had to work really hard at tracking his story as well. He starts off the show thinking, oh, I'm coming to the circus. It's probably my last chance. I'm going to go home. And through talking to these people of the present day circus and beginning to share a story that he had never really shared with anybody, and realizing that that was such a vibrant chapter, and he's just lost everything again, and he's not happy where he is, that he's about to start running again. And so tracking that story required not just work with Rick, but with Greg,
Yeah.
so that when he's narrating about, what it was like to see the menagerie for the first time, that he's experiencing it and saying, like, I'm feeling goosebumps again. I haven't felt goosebumps in, 15 years. So he also has to sort of plumb the depths and track where in his story he's beginning to realize that he's going to be making a change. Who are you when you lose everything? Do you sit in a home and wait to die, or do you maybe join the circus one last time?
Yeah. I was also thinking, the last time we talked was when you were Tony nominated for Kimberly Akimbo, and I cannot think of two shows that are more opposite. I think, the intimacy of Kimberly Akimbo and then the fusion of all these arts with Water for Elephants. And you mentioned you got the jobs around the same time. Despite them being opposite, did they inform each other at all? Did you pull from, something from each one to inform the other?
He did. Well, actually the common thread, because Kim also is making a choice. She decides to leave, She has very little time left, and she chooses to go on a great adventure. So in that sense, there is very similar territory in terms of pain and beauty being intertwined, and forging ahead and saying yes. And she chooses to fall in love even though she's dying. And Jacob has lost his parents and is looking around and sees nothing and sees an impossible situation and chooses to see the stars in the sky. So there is shared emotional territory. Physically, they're very different. and,
Yeah.
even, the thing about Kimberly is it started as a play, and the book in Kimberly, and I love Rick's book in Elephants, but it's much more dreamlike and impressionist, and you know it, David Lindsay Bear's book is truly the bedrock of that musical, and it requires a different attack with the actors, and there's much it's so hilarious and so gorgeous, and it's got so many more sharper edges, which I love. um and Elephants is a little squishier, and a little gentler and more impressionistic,
Yeah.
um
Well, before I let you go, just quickly, we're now like a year removed from that Tony Awards experience, which is always quite a whirlwind experience on Broadway. Do you have, looking back on it now, a favorite moment from that time?
from the Tony time.
Yeah, when you became a nominee.
um that's a hard question, because I have a funny relationship to all of it, and it doesn't make for a good interview. but but I I was so proud of our show. That was the thing I cared the most about. Was that, and particularly for David and Janine, I was so proud of our show. And so to have that pat on the back felt great. I think for me personally, there was a moment where I went to get my little pin, and it wasn't so much that I thought, ah, I've made it, or that stuff doesn't really get at me in the same way. But I did feel like, wow, 8-year-old Jess would have been really psyched about this. Like, so I think when you get older and you have kids, and work becomes thankfully and beautifully multidimensional, some of that stuff can feel, it doesn't get at you in the same way that your kids do, you know.
Yeah.
But that was cool. That was cool
Yeah.
being a part of it and getting that pin and feeling like, God, this was something I thought about when I was young, and what a funny thing to be here now, you know.
Hmm.
I also fell on the stage when we went to get when we won Best Musical. I didn't see a lip, and I went down in front of the entire theater, and Janine swept me up. I don't know how she did it, like single-handedly, like a superhero. She got me to my feet again. Anyway, so those are two pretty big memories.
Moments that will keep you humble. There's always a reminder. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for sitting down with me. Wonderful work on Water for Elephants. And everyone who is watching, make sure you stick with Gold Derby for the rest of the season. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.